probably one of the biggest problems facing this discourse today about energy efficiency, sustainability, building performance, and generally value creation in the built environment. And let me say this from the very beginning is actually I would really like to commend the Architects Council of Europe, because putting this issue on the map, we tend to oversimplify value creation in the built environment. And I'm not an architect. I will probably have a different take on this. So therefore, please bear with me just for a couple of minutes. I mean, this is really just a personal comment, because why value and demand is really important. I mean, it seems that over the last 10, 15 years, we have been focusing solely on technical solutions. And we have been focusing, as we heard still today in the discussions, it was really about cost optimality and savings on the energy bill. And where does that really left us? Well, over the last 10, 15 years, it's at maximum, I think we can talk about the low-hanging fruits, but really the uptake of energy efficiency improvements, especially talking about the existing building stock, I don't think it really has improved significantly. So therefore, really, the key to unlocking this is value and demand. And these two, because essentially value and demand are they are extremely intimately closely linked entities, right? And following the discussion today, I also allow me just to be a bit controversial for the sake of the discussion, but there's a growing sentiment that I have that because valuation and valuers are somewhat in the middle of essentially translating that building performance into financial performance as well as acting as a sort of independent axis for within the real estate and the built environment value chain, I think there are really, really heavy burden on our shoulder. On one hand, I've been asked today, just following the discussion as valuers, to solve somewhat the problem of the architecture, how to create value in terms of architecture. The banks who are now looking into these issues how to capture that value, but as well what constitutes value in terms of good design, in terms of architecture. So I'm going to go in that in a couple of minutes as well. But I also feel that there is a growing pressure and expectations from us, from the investment and the banking community, because they also realize that this is really something that will impact on their risk and balance sheets. And the outstanding assets on the banks of the balance sheets in terms of the buildings, in terms of mortgages, are really extremely expensive for banks. So therefore, they want really a reduction in their capital cost. They want a preferential treatment. They want a more risk-sensitive assessment, i.e., a risk analysis which is sensitive to green building features, that these are more resilient to changing market preferences, to climate change, and therefore they are more risk-proven as well. So therefore these cost less, and therefore really they get a sort of recognition from the banking regulators. The policymakers as well, it seems that they are putting pressure on us in terms of the value, explaining the value creation, because they're somewhat looking for a confirmation for the fact that the energy performance regulation as well as the resource efficiency regulation is essentially working, is producing positive impact. This is what we have seen, that, for instance, all these meta-studies which are providing that there is an uplift of, let's say, 1 or 2% if you are moving up in the EPC band from, let's say, a D building to a C. Right? I quickly skip this through. We are not representing only valuers, but today I will be talking mostly about valuers. And again, I would just like to commend the Architects Council of Europe, because it is suggesting a whole life, a quite holistic view on these issues, because then we will see later on how these really are impacting on the value drivers. Right? As a professional body, this is essentially what we try to do in order to make the value assessments more sensitive to green performance features. And what we know is that we need better data, and this is, I think, where designers, architects as well, who are probably the ones who are on the supply side of this data, and we really need to think how we are going to keep all those useful data which is produced at the design phase as well as the construction phase, and how we can capture this better, how we can manage this, and how we can use this later on through the use phase of the property. Okay, we need market research as well. This is very important. I think Andreas was mentioning about building the business case, right? This is those sort of market research and which looks into the market sentiments, which try to pick up all the market trends. Okay, what are essentially the value drivers? Because this is very difficult. Energy efficiency and sustainability just doesn't directly translate into value or into an improved value, right? They will translate into an improved financial value or risk if the market is ready to pay for that. But for that, we essentially need that sort of clarity. We need that evidence base. We need that transparency. We need to know essentially where we are situating in let's say, an upcycle or down cycle of the economy. And finally, we need capacity building. I think that was also mentioned as well, that architects as well as building professionals generally, they will need to build up their skill sets. Right? I'm going to skip. Okay, well, this is again, I think why value is again important. Value is measurable, but this is already a debatable thing because we are going to go into that in a second. Value is in a way half science. I mean, yes, you provide a market value, which is a quantitative value, but it's also half art. And when we are assessing the architectural value or the inherent design value of certain buildings, this is, I think, when things will get a bit more tricky, right? And this is again reaching out, right, to another community which is talking a completely different language. The language understood by investment communities, by the banking community, is really something like discounted cash flow, yield, exit yield, market value, mortgage lending value, investment worth, and so on, right? This is not the language that, for instance, the building community and the tools which have the building community at their disposal are able to provide, okay? So therefore, it's really important to make this link, right? I skip over this because you are really familiar with this, how, you know, the vicious circle of blame, as well as how we can turn this. These are a few examples of European projects that we try to build up, again, that sort of evidence base, try to improve the market in terms of transparency, trying to build up the evidence, the skill sets of professionals. And finally, this is the energy efficiency mortgage project is something which if I'm allowed, just for a second, just to highlight why this is important. Because again, banks are looking into this issue. And they are a very important port of call because they are in touch with homeowners at a very, very important point. And this is when essentially a potential home buyer goes to a bank, and if the bank can allow preferential interest rates and therefore or a higher loan to value, i.e. extra money, to incentivize energy efficiency improvements together with probably some other improvements within the building, I think this is an important moment of incentivizing essentially the homeowner to act on this, right? And this is why is this important? Because this is not about the cost optimality. This is not like the Green Deal about the golden rule on how much we can save and how much essentially the cost of the refurbishment can be paid back in terms of the savings. This is about linking the building performance to the risk, linking the building performance to the risk profile of the asset. And therefore, if you are able to also demonstrate that there is an evidence which actually links the enhanced building performance to a reduced probability of default, that can also link back to the reduced capital charges for the bank. So there is a clear incentive to make this work. And I think yesterday at the Sustainable Energy Week event about the voluntary tools, we've been talking about this, that we really need to look not only about the performance aspect of the buildings, but also linking that to the financial regulation and essentially making also the financial regulation more sensitive to these issues. All right? These are a few barriers we are aware of. I've already talked about this. This is essentially why we need data. And as we gradually build up the data, we'll have better quality of data, which will allow also more certainty about the way how we are going to do our risk assessment. So we know with absolutely more certainty what is essentially the margin between which a building operates, as well as its risk exposure in terms of finances or in terms of a bank loan, a mortgage loan. Okay, this is the juicy stuff that Judith asked me to quickly put on the map. And this is just to understand what are the sort of value drivers or property performance aspects which essentially can influence the market value, or essentially what is the purpose of the valuation, because this can be different. And this essentially, the purpose of the valuation, who is commissioning the valuation, for what purposes, can really influence also the sort of potential value drivers. Okay, and this is something like when you did ask me, okay, but what are essentially those aspects which drives what are the quantitative tools which are able to assess the architectural value? It's something I would say, well, this is really difficult, and this is something I would like to put back to you essentially. How do you conceptualize? How do you define essentially what is good architecture? Any taker on this? How do you define what is good architecture? Because then I can also talk about, okay, well, this is like, it's really different. What's the difference between valuing, for instance, a piece of art, a painting, and what is, and valuing a car, which is a mass-produced, fairly similar, often transactioned sort of good? Okay, how do I do this, essentially? There is clearly a difference. Okay, I have a few suggestions of how this can be done properly, but I think what is very important for architects to keep in mind in terms of maximizing essentially the value of their design is, I think, and that of the cultural values, is important to link it to the flexibility, the durability, the resilience, the adaptability. And because we are talking about subjective values here, essentially, I think it's very important to listen to what the needs of the homeowners or the clients are. So it's really catering for their needs and adding that sort of subjective value. So, and what is also very important, what we are convincing our valuers at least about, is that to treat this in a sort of holistic way and an integral part of evaluation. This is outside of the sort of standard book of evaluation, right? But this sustainability and good design essentially is part of this of evaluation process. Okay, it's the same thing more or less. A sort of mapping of how sustainability building features feed into different resulting effects. And this is important because, again, I was talking about the purposes of valuation, which are different. So therefore, the valuation drivers are also different. And therefore, it's really difficult to come with a sort of blanket statement because this is really varies according to markets, according to cultures, and so on and so on. And this is my final slide. Essentially, I try to do a sort of mapping of what are the sort of value drivers which are important to the various stakeholder communities, and where what is essentially the checklist according to who is the client, who is, in what role, is it the financing, and so on, for whom what is essentially important. Okay, and I would be happy to discuss this in more detail when I get questions. Thank you.